The morning sun glared against the towering glass buildings of New York City, its golden rays bouncing off the endless steel structures that stretched into the sky. Ethan Caldwell, a 35-year-old self-made millionaire, stood near the window of his luxurious office on the 50th floor, gazing down at the world below. His tailored Armani suit fit him like a second skin, and the Rolex on his wrist gleamed with the mark of success. Everything about Ethan screamed power and control, except for the quiet emptiness gnawing at his insides. "Sir, your next meeting starts in 5 minutes." His assistant's voice crackled over the intercom. Ethan sighed. "Thank you, Rachel. I'll be there shortly." He straightened his tie, smoothing a hand over his perfectly styled raven black hair. But his mind drifted, not to the multi-million-dollar deal waiting for him, but to a memory from years ago. A memory of her. Meanwhile, across town, in a small but elegant apartment overlooking Central Park, Isabella Monroe stood in front of her bedroom mirror, her hands trembling as she adjusted her dress. She took a deep breath, trying to steady her nerves, but her heart wouldn't stop pounding. "You can do this, Bella," she whispered to herself, running a hand over her stomach, flat now, but carrying a secret that would change everything. Her fingers rested there for a moment, as though offering silent reassurance to the unborn child growing inside her. Today, she was finally going to tell Ethan the truth. For years, she had stood by his side, supporting his ambition, his dreams, his hunger for success. She had believed in his love until it had started to slip away. Until she had felt the coldness in his touch, the distance in his words, until she had begun to wonder if she was truly enough for him anymore. She took one final glance in the mirror and whispered, "No matter what happens, I have to tell him." 1 hour later, at the restaurant, Isabella sat at a corner table in an upscale restaurant, nervously stirring her coffee, glancing at the entrance every few seconds. Ethan was late. She checked her phone, no messages. It wasn't unusual for Ethan to get caught up in work, but today was different. She had planned this lunch weeks in advance. She needed to tell him about the baby, their baby. Taking a deep breath, she tried to calm the storm inside her. But then, she saw him. Her heart jumped in relief, until she noticed something that made her stomach drop. Ethan wasn't alone. Beside him, laughing and clinging to his arm, was a woman Isabella recognized all too well, Sienna Lawson, his stunning new executive assistant. For a moment, Isabella couldn't breathe. Her mind raced. Maybe it's just business. Maybe I'm overreacting. But then, she saw it. The way Ethan looked at Sienna. The way he had once looked at her. The way his hand rested on Sienna's waist as they strolled through the mall. As if they had done this 100 times before. The realization hit like a punch to the gut. Her fiancé, the father of her child, was cheating on her. Right there, in broad daylight, with no shame, no hesitation. Something inside Isabella snapped. She stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor, and marched toward them, her hands trembling but her voice steady. "Ethan." The moment his name left her lips, he froze. She watched as his cocky smile faded, his muscles tensing as though he had been caught in a trap. Sienna's bright red lips curled into a smirk as she leaned closer into Ethan, as if staking her claim. Isabella's voice shook with hurt and betrayal, but she held her ground. "We had lunch planned today. Did you forget?" Ethan hesitated for half a second, then let out a frustrated sigh, running a hand through his hair. "Bella, this isn't a good time." Not a good time? She felt the world around her spinning. She was carrying his child, and he was here, parading another woman in front of her like she didn't exist. Isabella swallowed the lump in her throat. "I need to talk to you. It's important." But Ethan just rolled his eyes. "I said now isn't a good time," he snapped, his voice sharp, dismissive, like she was nothing more than a nuisance. Sienna laughed, a cruel, mocking sound. "Oh, sweetie," she said, feigning concern, "maybe you should take a hint. Ethan has more important things to do." The words cut deeper than a knife. More important things to do? Like cheating on his fiancée? Like abandoning the life growing inside her? A few onlookers had stopped, their whispers filling the air like poison. Isabella's eyes burned with tears, but she refused to let them fall. "Ethan," she whispered, her voice barely holding together. "How could you do this?" Ethan groaned, glancing around at the growing crowd. "Bella, stop making a scene." "A scene?" Was that all he cared about? Not her. Not their unborn baby. Just his precious reputation. Something inside her shattered. She took one last look at the man she had loved for years. The man she had sacrificed everything for, and realized he was gone. Or maybe, he had never been there at all. With a shaking breath, she turned on her heels and walked away. Sienna's mocking laughter followed her as she disappeared into the crowd. But Isabella didn't stop. Not until she was outside. Not until she felt the cold air sting her tear-streaked face. Not until she finally let out a silent, broken sob. For the love she had lost. For the future she had once dreamed of. For the child who would now grow up without a father. Her hands instinctively wrapped around her stomach, as if protecting the tiny heartbeat within her. She took a deep, trembling breath and whispered, "I'll take care of you. My love, I promise." And with that, Isabella Monroe walked away from Ethan Caldwell forever. Little did he know, he had just lost everything. What happens next? Will Isabella raise her baby alone? Will Ethan realize his mistake before it's too late? What do you think of Ethan's betrayal? Would you ever forgive someone like him? Let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more emotional stories that touch the heart. The lights of New York City glowed like 1,000 stars against the midnight sky. But to Isabella Monroe, the once dazzling city now felt like a cage of memories she couldn't escape. The weight of Ethan's betrayal still clung to her like a ghost. A painful reminder that everything she had built, the love, the trust, the dreams of a future together, had been nothing more than a beautiful illusion. She sat in the dimly lit corner of her tiny apartment, her hands protectively cradling her still flat stomach. "I will never let you feel unwanted," she whispered to the life growing inside her. Tears silently traced the contours of her face. But they weren't just for herself anymore. They were for her baby, Ethan's baby. The very man who had humiliated her in public, who had discarded her like she meant nothing, was the father of her child. How could I have been so blind? The memories came like a tidal wave, drowning her in the pain of the past. "Isabella, you worried too much." Ethan's voice had been smooth, dismissive, wrapped in the arrogance of a man who thought he would never lose her. "I'm just saying," Isabella had murmured, biting her lip. "You've been spending a lot of late nights at work. And now, this new assistant of yours." Ethan had laughed, his expression filled with amusement, not reassurance. "You think I'm cheating?" he had asked, raising an eyebrow. She had hesitated, because even then, some part of her already knew. But she had shaken her head, trying to convince herself that the man she loved would never betray her. "No," she had whispered. I miss you." Ethan had sighed, running a hand through his hair before stepping forward to cup her face. "You're overthinking things. Bella, stop worrying, okay? You're my wife. Nothing's going to change that." She had believed him. She had trusted him. And just months later, she had stood in the middle of a crowded mall, watching as Ethan paraded his mistress around as though Isabella had never existed. The pain was unbearable. She had left Ethan behind that day. But his betrayal followed her everywhere. It was in the whispers of strangers who had seen everything. In the pitying glances of friends who didn't know what to say. And worst of all, it was in the silence that now filled her life. The absence of his voice, his touch, his love. Everywhere she turned, Ethan's shadow loomed over her like a curse. The world continued spinning without him. But Isabella felt like she had been left behind. Her phone buzzed, a message from her landlord reminding her that the rent was due. Her hand tightened around the device, her chest constricting with anxiety. She had quit her job months ago, planning to focus on her pregnancy. Back then, she had believed Ethan would be by her side, supporting her as they prepared for their child's arrival. Now, she was alone. She pressed her hand against her stomach, whispering, "I'll figure something out, I promise." But deep down, she wasn't sure how. It had been weeks since Isabella had seen Ethan. Weeks since he had humiliated her in front of the world, choosing his mistress over the woman who had stood beside him for years. She had sworn she would never reach out to him again. But now, sitting in her cold, empty apartment, with her savings dwindling and her baby's future uncertain, she found herself staring at his number. Her pride screamed at her to let it go, to move on without ever looking back. But her baby deserved more than her stubbornness. Her hands trembled as she finally pressed the call button. The phone rang, once, twice. Then, the line clicked. She heard his familiar voice, but it wasn't warm. It wasn't the voice of the man she had once loved. It was cold, impatient, distant. Isabella? For a moment, she couldn't speak. Just hearing his voice again stirred up emotions she wasn't ready to face. Ethan, she finally whispered, her voice barely holding together. A pause. Then, a sigh. What do you want? He asked, as if he were annoyed by her very existence. Isabella clenched her fists. She had told herself she wouldn't cry. But his coldness cut deeper than any blade. She took a deep breath, forcing the words out before she lost her courage. I'm pregnant. Silence. Then, laughter. Not joy, not relief. A mocking, disbelieving laugh. Oh, come on, Isabella. Ethan scoffed. You expect me to believe that? You're just saying this to get me back. Her heart stopped. The blood in her veins turned to ice. She had imagined 100 different reactions from him. Shock, fear, maybe even regret. But she had never expected cruelty. You think I would lie about this? She asked, her voice breaking. Ethan sighed again, his voice dripping with indifference. I don't know what game you're playing, Bella, but whatever it is, I'm not interested. Tears burned in her eyes. But she bit her lip, refusing to let them fall. She should have known better. Ethan had shown her who he was the moment he chose Sienna over her. She had just been too blind to see it. Forget it, she whispered, ending the call. And just like that, it was over. Isabella stared at her phone, her hands still trembling, but something inside her shifted. For too long, she had been waiting for Ethan to come back, waiting for an apology, waiting for him to care. But she was done waiting. Ethan had already made his choice. And now, she was making hers, wiping the last tear from her face. Isabella rose to her feet, her heart pounding with determination. She wasn't just living for herself anymore. She was living for her child. She had a future to build, a life to create, and she would do it without him. Isabella Monroe was done crying over a man who never deserved her in the first place. With newfound strength, she whispered, I will never need you, Ethan, not now, not ever. And with that, she walked forward, not looking back. Not even once. Isabella has finally let go of Ethan. But can she truly rebuild her life alone? Do you think Ethan will regret his choices? Will Isabella's strength be enough to carry her through? The city outside was alive with lights and movement. But inside Isabella Monroe's apartment, a storm raged in her heart. She had spent weeks telling herself that she was over it, over him. Over the betrayal. Over the public humiliation that still played in her mind like a cruel, endless film. She had told herself that she didn't need Ethan. That she didn't need anyone. But some nights were harder than others. She sat at the kitchen table, her hands resting on her stomach. The baby inside her the only thing keeping her from falling apart completely. Outside, the city moved on, people went to work, fell in love, built their futures. But Isabella? She felt like she was stuck in time, trapped in a past she didn't know how to escape. How could someone so powerful feel so helpless? Ever since Ethan's cruel rejection, Isabella had been walking through life in a daze. The man she had once trusted more than anyone had not only abandoned her, but he had mocked the very idea that she could be carrying his child. She could still hear the mocking tone in his voice. You expect me to believe that? You're just saying this to get me back. The words had cut deeper than any knife, leaving scars that no one could see but she could feel with every breath. She had considered calling him again. Maybe she hadn't explained it the right way. Maybe if she had been calmer, if she hadn't sounded so desperate, he would have listened. But deep down, Isabella knew the ugly truth. Ethan didn't care, and he never would. So, she had done the only thing she could do. She chose herself. She found a job, something simple but stable. Something that would let her pay the rent and prepare for the baby. She had started saving, counting every penny, making sure that when the time came, she could stand on her own 2 feet. She had even begun attending parenting classes, learning how to change diapers, how to swaddle a newborn, how to do everything alone. But no matter how much she prepared for the future, the past had a way of haunting her in the quiet moments. One afternoon, as Isabella walked home from the grocery store, she heard whispers. 2 women stood on the sidewalk, talking in hushed tones. Did you hear about Ethan Carter? One of them asked, her voice laced with curiosity. Of course, the other woman replied. That whole scandal at the mall? Everyone saw it. Imagine being dumped like that in public. And she was pregnant. The first woman gasped. Isabella stopped in her tracks. Her heart pounding. They were talking about her. The humiliation came rushing back. Her hands gripping the paper bag so tightly that her knuckles turned white. They don't even know me. And yet they think they know my pain. She wanted to scream. She wanted to tell them that they had no idea what it felt like to be discarded like trash. To have the man you loved laugh in your face when you told him you were carrying his child. But she said nothing. Instead, she turned away and kept walking. Her back straight, her chin high. She was done being the woman people pitied. She would be more than a tragedy. That night, Isabella sat at her desk, pen in hand, staring at the blank sheet of paper before her. For weeks, she had resisted the urge to write. To tell him everything, not for herself, but for the child growing inside her. But tonight, she could no longer fight it. With trembling hands, she began to write. Ethan, I don't know why I'm writing this. Maybe because I don't want our child to grow up without knowing the truth. I wish I could hate you. But the truth is, I don't. I hate what you did. I hate the way you made me feel. But I don't hate you. I don't expect you to suddenly care. I don't expect you to want to be a father. But one day, when you look back at your life, when the noise of the world fades and you are left with nothing but your regrets, I hope you remember this moment. I hope you remember the choice you made. Because I will never forget it. Goodbye, Ethan. Isabella folded the letter carefully, sliding it into an envelope. But she didn't send it. Instead, she tucked it away, deep inside her desk drawer. Alongside all the other things she had once believed in. Ethan would never read it. And maybe that was for the best. Months passed. Isabella had grown stronger, more independent. She had built a life for herself. A life without Ethan. But then, on a cold autumn morning, she received a knock on the door. When she opened it, her heart nearly stopped. Standing in the hallway, looking more disheveled than she had ever seen him, was Ethan Carter. Her first instinct was to slam the door in his face, to pretend that he no longer existed. But then she saw his eyes, not filled with arrogance, not filled with indifference, but with something she never thought she would see again. Regret. I need to talk to you, he said, his voice hoarse, as if the words physically hurt to say. Isabella crossed her arms, her body rigid. I have nothing to say to you, Ethan. He ran a hand through his hair. Sighing. Please, he whispered, just hear me out. For a moment, Isabella hesitated. Then, with a deep breath, she stepped aside. 5 minutes, she said coldly. Ethan nodded, stepping into the apartment, his eyes immediately drawn to the tiny crib in the corner of the room. His expression softened, and for the first time, Isabella saw the cracks in the man she had once loved. You never told me, he murmured, almost to himself. Isabella let out a bitter laugh. I did, you just didn't listen. Ethan turned to face her, his eyes filled with something unfamiliar. I was an idiot, he admitted. I was selfish, and I was blind. But, Isabella, I swear, I never stopped thinking about you. She stared at him, searching his face for the truth. Did she still love him? Could she ever forgive him? She wasn't sure, but one thing was certain. This wasn't the end of their story. It was just the beginning. The night was cold, the wind howling through the narrow streets of the city, whispering secrets that no one wanted to hear. Isabella Monroe stood by the window of her small apartment, staring out into the darkness. She had fought hard to rebuild her life, to piece together the broken fragments of her soul after Ethan Carter's betrayal. But the wounds he left behind were deeper than she had realized. She hugged herself, trying to ignore the storm raging inside her. It had been months since he had shown up at her doorstep. His eyes filled with regret. His voice cracked with apologies she never thought she would hear. And yet, despite her resistance, a tiny part of her heart still trembled at the sound of his name. Why now? She whispered into the empty room. She had survived without him. She had learned how to be strong, how to stand on her own 2 feet. She had prepared herself for single motherhood, knowing that she could never count on Ethan again. But now, he was back, and he wasn't leaving. Isabella's grip on the coffee mug tightened when she heard a knock on the door. Her heart stuttered in her chest, but she forced herself to stay calm. She wasn't that woman anymore, the woman who had once begged Ethan to listen. The woman who had wept in front of an entire crowd. The woman he had humiliated without hesitation. She was stronger now. Taking a deep breath, She walked to the door and opened it. There he was. Ethan Carter stood in the dim hallway, looking nothing like the arrogant, ruthless businessman she once knew. His once perfectly tailored suits were now slightly wrinkled, his sharp gaze duller, his confidence replaced by something broken, something almost human. "Isabella," he said, his voice hoarse, as if he hadn't slept in days. She folded her arms, refusing to let her emotions show. "Why are you here?" He exhaled heavily, running a hand through his hair. "I needed to see you." She narrowed her eyes. "You saw me months ago. That didn't stop you from disappearing again." He winced. She had expected him to argue, to throw out an excuse. But he didn't. Instead, he nodded slowly, as if accepting her anger, her resentment, her right to hate him. "You're right," he admitted. "I should have never left that day. I should have fought harder. I should have." He stopped, swallowing hard. "I made a mistake, Isabella, a terrible mistake. And now, She shook her head, her heart pounding. "You don't get to walk back into my life whenever it's convenient for you." "Ethan, I know," he said, stepping forward, "but I'm not here for convenience. I'm here because." He hesitated, and for the first time, Isabella saw something new in his eyes. Fear. Pure, unfiltered fear. And it made her blood run cold. "What's wrong?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Ethan licked his lips, glancing around as if he expected someone to jump out of the shadows at any moment. "I need you to listen to me carefully," he said, his voice lower now. "Urgent. I think someone is trying to hurt you." A shiver ran down Isabella's spine. "What are you talking about?" she demanded, her stomach twisting with unease. Ethan clenched his jaw, glancing over his shoulder before stepping inside and shutting the door behind him. He turned to face her, his entire body tense. "I've been looking into things," he admitted, his voice rough. "After I found out about the baby, I started asking questions, and the more I asked, the more I realized something wasn't right." She froze. "What do you mean?" Ethan exhaled sharply. "It's Melissa." The name sent a fresh wave of nausea through Isabella's stomach. Melissa, Ethan's former lover, the woman he had left her for, the woman who had laughed at her pain. "What about her?" Isabella asked, her voice tight. Ethan's expression darkened. "She knows about the baby." Isabella's breath caught in her throat. Melissa knew? She had gone out of her way to erase Ethan from her life, to protect her unborn child from his toxic world. She had wanted nothing more than to forget his existence. But now, the woman who had ruined her already shattered life knew about her baby. "How?" Isabella whispered. Ethan rubbed his temples. "I don't know. I didn't tell her." He looked at her with genuine regret, his voice strained with emotion. "But I think she's been following me, watching me. She found out." Isabella took a step back, her hands instinctively going to her stomach. "No," she breathed. "She wouldn't." "She would," Ethan interrupted, his voice laced with urgency. "You don't know what she's capable of, Isabella. And now that she knows about the baby, I don't know what she's planning." Isabella felt sick. She had spent so long fighting to move forward, to heal, to create a life where she and her child would be safe. But now, the past was closing in on her again. And this time, she wasn't sure she could escape. Isabella's breath came in short, sharp gasps. She needed to think. She needed to protect her baby. "What do you want me to do?" she finally asked, her voice shaking. Ethan stepped forward, his eyes pleading. "Come with me." She stiffened. "Excuse me? I have a place," he said quickly. "Somewhere safe. If she's watching you, if she's planning something, you need to get out of here." She shook her head. "No," she said firmly. "I don't need you to protect me. Ethan, I can handle this." Ethan let out a frustrated breath, his hands balling into fists. "Damn it, Isabella, this isn't just about you anymore," he snapped. "She's dangerous. If she wants to hurt you, she won't stop until she does." She flinched, her anger colliding with her fear. For months, she had been the one fighting alone, the one taking care of everything. And now, Ethan thought he could just step in and take over? She wanted to scream at him. She wanted to slam the door in his face. But deep down, she knew he was right. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for her child. Isabella swallowed hard, tears burning her eyes as she looked around her small apartment, the place where she had spent nights crying herself to sleep. The place where she had rebuilt herself from the ashes of her past. She had finally created a home. And now, she had to leave it behind. Fine, she whispered, but this doesn't mean I forgive you. Ethan. A flicker of pain crossed his face. But he nodded. I know, he said, but I'll protect you anyway. As they hurried out of the apartment, Isabella's heart pounded. The night air was heavy. The shadows stretching across the streets like silent threats. Was Melissa out there? Was she watching? She tightened her grip on her stomach, whispering a silent promise to the life growing inside her. I won't let anything happen to you. She had fought too hard. She would not lose everything now. Will Isabella escape? Will she make it to safety before Melissa makes her move? Comment below and show your support for Isabella. Like this post if you believe she deserves a happy ending. Subscribe and stay tuned for the next part of this emotional journey. Because her fight isn't over yet. The world outside was still. But inside Isabella's heart, a storm raged on. The weight of fear, betrayal, and uncertainty had been pressing on her shoulders for far too long. But tonight, it felt suffocating. She sat in the dimly lit motel room, cradling her belly, whispering to her unborn child. We're going to be okay, she murmured, pressing her hand over the gentle movement she felt beneath her skin. I'll protect you, no matter what. But even as she said the words, a terrifying thought crept into her mind. What if she couldn't? What if she failed? She shook her head, refusing to let that thought take root. She had survived so much already. She had clawed her way out of despair, rebuilt herself from the ground up, and fought to create a life of stability and safety. She wasn't about to let Melissa, or Ethan, or anyone, tear that away from her now. Ethan paced near the window, his shoulders tense, his phone clutched tightly in his hand. Isabella watched him from the bed, her arms instinctively wrapped around herself. She still didn't know if she could trust him. No, she knew she couldn't. But that didn't change the cold, hard truth. Melissa was out there. And Melissa was dangerous. Ethan's voice was low and sharp when he finally spoke. No, I don't care what it costs. Find out where she is. He hissed into the phone before ending the call abruptly. He turned back to Isabella, his expression grim. She's not in the city. Isabella felt her heart drop. What do you mean? She left. Ethan muttered. She's covering her tracks. A chill ran down Isabella's spine. That wasn't good. That meant Melissa was planning something. She had never expected Melissa to just walk away, not after everything. But knowing she was out there, somewhere, waiting, watching, it made Isabella's skin crawl. She exhaled slowly. Then what do we do now? Ethan hesitated. He was used to being in control, used to knowing all the answers. But now, he looked as lost as she felt. I don't know, he admitted. And for the first time since their paths had crossed again, Isabella saw something real in him. Not the arrogant businessman she once knew. Not the man who had thrown her aside. Just a man who had lost his way. A part of her wanted to believe that maybe, just maybe, he was capable of change. But another part of her, the part that still felt the sting of his betrayal like fresh wounds on her skin, knew better than to trust too easily. The motel room was small, claustrophobic, the air thick with unspoken words and unfinished wounds. Ethan sat on the chair near the window, his jaw clenched, while Isabella lay on the bed, trying to calm the storm inside her chest. But no matter how much she tried, she couldn't shake the unease that had settled in her bones. Her body had always known when something wasn't right. And right now, something wasn't right. Suddenly, a sharp pain shot through her stomach. Isabella gasped, her fingers digging into the sheets as her breath hitched. Ethan was by her side in an instant. What's wrong? She shook her head, forcing herself to breathe through it. I don't know, she whispered. It's too soon. Panic flickered in Ethan's eyes. We need to get you to a hospital. No, she said quickly, fear tightening in her chest. If we go to a hospital, she'll find me. Ethan hesitated, clearly torn. We don't have a choice, he said finally. Your safety, the baby's safety, is more important than hiding. Isabella's breath came in sharp, shallow gasps. She had spent so long running, so long trying to stay one step ahead of the past that threatened to swallow her whole. But now, she had no choice. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for her child. And that meant she had to be strong, even if it terrified her. The drive to the hospital was a blur of red lights and desperate prayers. Isabella clutched her belly, silent tears slipping down her cheeks, her mind filled with worst-case scenarios. "Please," she begged silently, "please let my baby be okay." Ethan's hands gripped the wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. "We're almost there," he kept saying, as if repeating the words would make it true. As soon as they pulled into the emergency entrance, Ethan rushed to Isabella's side, helping her out of the car. She barely registered the nurses swarming around her, the cold air of the hospital, the bright fluorescent lights. All she knew was fear. Unrelenting, suffocating fear. They wheeled her into a room, placing monitors around her belly. And then, a heartbeat. Steady, strong. Relief flooded through her, and a single sob escaped her lips. "Your baby is okay," the doctor assured her, "but you need to rest. Too much stress isn't good for either of you." Isabella nodded weakly, exhaustion settling into her bones. Ethan was by her side, his expression unreadable. "Isabella," he said softly. She turned her head toward him, barely able to keep her eyes open. He swallowed hard. "I know I don't deserve to ask for anything, but please, let me stay." For a long moment, she said nothing. Then, finally, she whispered, "Okay." And before she could second-guess herself, sleep pulled her under. When Isabella woke up, the room was dimly lit, the only sound the gentle beeping of the heart monitor. For a moment, she forgot where she was. Then, reality crashed down. She turned her head, and saw Ethan sitting in the chair beside her. His head bowed, his hands clasped tightly together as if in silent prayer. For a man who once had everything, he suddenly looked like a man who had lost more than he could bear. She didn't know what to say. Did she forgive him? No. Did she trust him? Absolutely not. But was he trying? She didn't want to admit it. But maybe he was. For the first time in years, Ethan wasn't walking away. And that, more than anything, terrified her. Because if she let herself believe it, if she let herself hope, and he failed her again, she didn't know if she would survive it. She took a deep breath, her hands gently resting on her belly, as if drawing strength from the tiny life growing inside her. No matter what happened next, she would be strong. For herself, for her baby, for the future that was still waiting to be written. What happens next? Will Isabella give Ethan another chance? Will she escape Melissa's grasp? Comment below and share your support for Isabella. She's been through so much, let her know she's not alone. Like this story if you believe she deserves happiness. Subscribe for the next chapter of this emotional journey. You won't want to miss it. Because sometimes, the hardest battles are the ones we fight within ourselves. The hospital room was quiet, except for the rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor. Isabella lay on the bed, her fingers tracing the curve of her belly absent-mindedly, exhaustion weighing heavily on her. She had barely slept in days. Her mind wouldn't let her rest, even though the doctor had reassured her that the baby was fine. That she needed to stay calm. The fear still lingered, a shadow that followed her everywhere. She turned her head and saw Ethan sitting in the chair beside her. Staring at his hands, he looked lost in thought, his jaw tight, his fingers twitching every so often, like he wanted to say something but didn't know how. She should have told him to leave. But she didn't. Because, for the first time since their paths had crossed again, he wasn't running away. And a part of her, a small, fragile part, was terrified that if she let him go now, he would never come back. She exhaled slowly, turning her gaze back to the ceiling. "What are you thinking about?" Ethan's voice broke the silence. Isabella hesitated, unsure if she wanted to tell him the truth. But then, the weight of everything became too much. And before she could stop herself, she whispered, "Her." Ethan stiffened. He didn't need to ask who Isabella was talking about. Melissa. The woman who had turned both of their lives upside down. The woman who still had the power to destroy everything. "You think she's still watching us?" Ethan asked, his voice quieter now, as if afraid to say the words too loudly. Isabella swallowed hard. "I know she is." A cold silence settled between them. Ethan exhaled sharply, rubbing his temples. "I should have seen it before. I should have stopped it before it got this far." Isabella closed her eyes. "It's too late for what ifs." Ethan, he was right. He should have seen it. But he hadn't. And because of that, she had spent years looking over her shoulder. Because of him, she had learned how to run, how to hide, how to survive with nothing but her wits and the sheer force of a mother's love. But now, it wasn't just about surviving. She wanted more than that. For herself. For her baby. And if Ethan was truly here to stay, if he really wanted to fix the damage he had caused, then maybe, just maybe, she wouldn't have to fight this battle alone. Ethan shifted in his seat, glancing at her belly, his expression unreadable. Does it hurt? He asked hesitantly. Isabella blinked at him, caught off guard by the question. No, she said softly, not the way you're thinking. He nodded, looking away. I never thought I'd have a child. Not after everything. There was something in his voice, regret. Maybe, or maybe just fear. And Isabella wasn't sure how she felt about that. Do you want to? She asked before she could stop herself. Ethan looked at her sharply. What? She swallowed, forcing herself to hold his gaze. Do you want to be a father? The question hung in the air between them. For a long moment, Ethan didn't answer. Then, slowly, he nodded. Yeah, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I do. Isabella's heart clenched painfully in her chest. Because for all the pain, for all the mistakes, she believed him. The night stretched on, and neither of them moved. But just as Isabella finally started to drift off, a noise made her freeze. A vibration, a buzz, a phone ringing. She opened her eyes, pulse spiking. Ethan pulled his phone out of his pocket, checking the screen, and the moment she saw the name flashing across it, she felt the air leave her lungs. Melissa. Ethan's expression darkened, his fingers tightening around the phone. He silenced it without answering, then placed it face down on the table beside him. But Isabella couldn't shake the feeling of dread creeping up her spine. Because Melissa wasn't calling just to say hello. She was calling because she knew. Minutes passed, maybe an hour. Ethan thought she had fallen asleep. But she wasn't asleep. She was listening, waiting, because she knew, Melissa wouldn't give up that easily. And then, another buzz. This time, it wasn't Ethan's phone. It was hers. Isabella reached for it hesitantly, her fingers trembling as she turned it over. A blocked number. She felt the blood drain from her face. She knew who it was. She knew before she even pressed answer. But she did it anyway. And the moment she did, a cold, familiar voice filled her ears. Oh, Isabella, you didn't really think you could hide from me forever, did you? Isabella felt the world tilt beneath her. Melissa laughed softly, the sound sending a shiver down her spine. You should have stayed gone, she whispered, because now, I'm going to make sure you regret ever coming back. The line went dead, and for the first time in years, Isabella felt true, paralyzing fear. Her fingers were still clenched around the phone when Ethan finally spoke. What did she say? Isabella slowly turned to him. She could see the fire in his eyes, the rage simmering just beneath the surface. But she also saw something else. Something that hadn't been there before. Determination. She's coming for me, Isabella whispered. Ethan shook his head firmly. No, he said, she's not this time. And for the first time since this nightmare began, Isabella didn't feel alone anymore. The night outside was still. The sky heavy with thick clouds that blocked out the moon. The city slept, but inside Isabella's apartment, there was no peace. She sat on the edge of the couch, her hands trembling around the mug of tea she had made hours ago but never drank. The weight of Melissa's words still pressed against her chest like a vice. You should have stayed gone. Because now, I'm going to make sure you regret ever coming back. Even now, hours later, the words echoed in her mind, crawling under her skin, making it impossible to breathe. Across from her, Ethan stood by the window. His jaw clenched so tightly she could see the tension in his neck. His hands were shoved deep into his pockets, his entire body rigid with barely contained anger. Neither of them had spoken for a long time. The silence stretched between them, thick and suffocating, filled with all the words they didn't know how to say. Finally, Ethan broke the silence. We need to be ready, he said, his voice low but filled with steel. Isabella let out a shaky breath, finally looking up at him. Ready for what? Ethan turned to her, his blue eyes burning with something fierce, something dangerous. For the war she's about to bring to our doorstep. Isabella closed her eyes for a moment, trying to calm the storm inside her. She had spent 3 years running, 3 years watching over her shoulder, 3 years waiting for the past to finally catch up with her. And now, it had. You don't understand, she whispered, setting her mug down with a trembling hand. Melissa, she doesn't play fair. She doesn't just ruin lives. Ethan, she destroys people. She enjoys it. Ethan exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. I know, he muttered. Believe me, I know. Do you? Isabella shot back, her voice rising as she stood up. Do you really? Because I don't think you do. You weren't the one she hunted. Ethan, you weren't the one who had to hide. Who had to beg for help? Who had to start over again and again just to stay one step ahead? Her voice cracked at the end, her emotions spilling over before she could stop them. Ethan flinched, but he didn't look away. Instead, he did something that shocked her. He stepped closer, and when he spoke, his voice was softer, but no less intense. You're right, he admitted. I wasn't the one who ran, but I was the one who let it happen. And I swear to you, Isabella, I will never let that happen again. Something inside Isabella wavered, because for the first time since Ethan had come back into her life, he didn't sound like the man she used to know. He sounded like someone else entirely. Someone she wanted to believe in. But could she? The baby kicked. A small, fluttering reminder that she wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. Isabella wrapped her arms around her belly instinctively, protectively, as she looked at Ethan. You say that now, she murmured. But what happens when Melissa comes at us with everything she has? What happens when she tries to destroy you? Too? Ethan let out a bitter laugh. She already did. Isabella, he said, you think I got out of this unscathed? You think I walked away from her without consequences? Isabella frowned, caught off guard by the anger in his voice. Ethan's gaze darkened. Melissa didn't just ruin you. She ruined me, too. I just didn't realize it until it was too late. Isabella's heart ached, because for the first time, she saw the pain in his eyes. She had spent so long hating him, blaming him, resenting him, that she had never once stopped to think about what he had lost. 2. Ethan had been blind to Melissa's cruelty back then, but he wasn't anymore. And that terrified Isabella more than anything. Because it meant that maybe, just maybe, they weren't as different as she thought. Maybe, they were just two broken people trying to put the shattered pieces back together. A knock at the door shattered the fragile moment between them. Isabella's blood turned to ice. She knew, before she even stood up, who it was. Ethan reached for her arm as she passed him, his grip firm but gentle. Isabella, wait. She hesitated, just for a second, before pulling away. And then, with her heart hammering in her chest, she opened the door. Melissa stood there, dressed in black, her red lips curling into a slow, sickly sweet smile. Well, she drawled, her eyes gleaming with amusement. You didn't think I'd let you hide forever, did you? Isabella forced herself to stand her ground. Her heart raced, but she refused to let Melissa see her fear. You have no power over me anymore, Isabella said, voice steady. Melissa laughed, stepping closer until they were inches apart. Oh, darling, she whispered, reaching out and grazing Isabella's cheek with her nails. You have no idea how wrong you are. Behind her, Ethan stepped forward. Step away from her, he ordered, his voice dark, dangerous. Melissa barely spared him a glance. Oh, Ethan, she sighed, shaking her head. You poor, stupid man. Do you really think you can save her? Ethan clenched his fists. I know I can. Melissa's eyes flickered with something unreadable. For the first time, she seemed surprised, like she hadn't expected him to fight back, like she hadn't expected him to choose Isabella over her. And that, more than anything, seemed to unsettle her. Melissa stepped back, her smile returning. This is going to be fun, she purred. And then, she was gone. Isabella collapsed against the door the second it closed, her breath ragged, her entire body shaking. Ethan was beside her in an instant, his hands on her shoulders, his face filled with worry. Are you okay? He asked softly. Isabella looked up at him, her eyes filled with something fierce. No, she whispered, but I will be. Because now, she wasn't alone anymore. For the first time in 3 years, she had someone to fight for her. And she wasn't going to let Melissa take that away. Not again. Not ever. What happens next? Melissa is playing her final game. Isabella is ready to fight back. Ethan is standing beside her. Will they finally win? Comment below and tell us what you think. Should Isabella trust Ethan? Should they fight back or run again? Let us know your thoughts. Like this story if you're rooting for Isabella to take her power back. Because some wars aren't just about survival. They're about taking back what was stolen. The hospital walls felt colder than usual. The beeping of machines echoed softly through the dimly lit room. The rhythmic rise and fall of Sophie's fragile chest was the only thing keeping Isabella from completely falling apart. Her daughter lay in the hospital bed, her tiny frame dwarfed by the crisp white sheets. A maze of tubes and wires connected to her delicate body. She looked so small, so helpless. Isabella gripped the edge of the chair she was sitting in, her knuckles white from the pressure. She had been here before. 3 years ago, the day Sophie was born, when doctors had rushed her away before Isabella could even hold her. That same gut-wrenching fear had filled her then. And now, she was here again, waiting, praying, hoping. A warm hand suddenly covered hers, breaking her out of her trance. Isabella turned, her tired, bloodshot eyes meeting Ethan's. He looked just as exhausted as she felt. His suit was wrinkled, his hair disheveled, and the dark circles under his eyes told her that he hadn't slept in days either. "She's strong," Ethan murmured. "She's going to make it." Isabella swallowed the lump in her throat. "You don't know that," she whispered. "The doctors said." Ethan squeezed her hand, cutting her off. "I know my daughter," he said, his voice firm but filled with emotion. "She's going to fight." Isabella closed her eyes, a single tear slipping down her cheek. She wanted to believe him. She really did. But every minute that passed felt like a lifetime. And every second that Sophie remained in that bed, stuck between life and death, felt like punishment for the mistakes Isabella had made in the past. Mistakes that had led them here. Mistakes that she would never forgive herself for. Ethan hadn't let go of Isabella's hand since they had arrived at the hospital. She wasn't sure if it was for her comfort or his own. But she didn't pull away. For the first time in years, she didn't want to be alone. "Do you remember when we used to talk about having kids?" Ethan asked suddenly, his voice barely above a whisper. Isabella let out a shaky breath. "Of course I do." She remembered everything. She remembered the nights they spent dreaming about the future. She remembered the way Ethan used to trace circles on her back while they lay in bed, whispering about baby names and what kind of parents they wanted to be. She remembered how safe she had felt in his arms. And she remembered the moment it all fell apart. The night Ethan had chosen Melissa over her. The night he had humiliated her in front of the world. The night he had shattered everything they had built together. Isabella pulled her hand away, suddenly feeling like she couldn't breathe. Ethan let her go, but his gaze remained locked onto hers. "I know I don't deserve your forgiveness," he admitted, his voice thick with regret. "And I know I don't deserve to be here right now. But, Isabella, I love her. I love our daughter. And no matter what happens between us, that will never change." Isabella bit her lip, her heart at war with her mind. She had spent years hating him. Years convincing herself that he didn't deserve to know Sophie. But looking at him now, seeing the pain in his eyes, the same pain she felt in her own heart, she realized something that terrified her more than anything. She wasn't sure if she hated him anymore. The door creaked open, and a nurse stepped inside. "Miss Thompson?" she said gently. "The doctor is ready to speak with you." Isabella's stomach twisted painfully. This was it. This was the moment that would decide everything. Ethan stood up first, offering his hand to Isabella. She hesitated. She had spent so long pushing him away. But right now, she needed to hold on to something. With a deep breath, she placed her hand in his. And together, they followed the nurse down the hall. The doctor's face was unreadable as he gestured for them to sit. "How is she?" Isabella asked immediately, her voice breaking. The doctor sighed, his expression softening. "Sophie is stable for now. But the tests show that her heart condition is worsening. If we don't operate soon." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. Isabella felt Ethan's grip on her hand tighten. "What are the risks?" Ethan asked. The doctor exhaled. "It's a complicated surgery. There are no guarantees. But without it, she won't." He stopped again, his eyes filled with sympathy. Isabella couldn't breathe. Her body felt like it was shutting down. This was her worst nightmare. A choice that wasn't a choice at all. If they did nothing, Sophie wouldn't make it. If they went through with the surgery, she could lose her anyway. It wasn't fair. It wasn't fair. It wasn't fair. Isabella felt her world spinning, falling apart piece by piece. And then, suddenly, she felt Ethan's arms around her. He was holding her, tightly, like she was the only thing keeping him standing. "We have to do it," Ethan murmured into her hair. We had to give her a chance. Isabella let out a choked sob, gripping the fabric of his shirt as if holding onto him would stop her from drowning. She wanted to scream. She wanted to run. She wanted someone to tell her what to do. But there was no other choice. With a deep, shaky breath, she nodded. Okay, she whispered. Ethan pulled back just enough to cup her face, his thumbs brushing away the tears streaming down her cheeks. She's going to be okay, he promised. And for the first time in years, Isabella wanted to believe him. That night, Ethan stayed with her in Sophie's hospital room. He sat beside Isabella on the tiny couch, their hands still intertwined. Neither of them spoke. They just watched over their daughter together. And as Ethan pressed a kiss to Isabella's forehead, whispering words of comfort she wasn't sure she believed, she realized something. Despite everything, despite the years of pain, despite the betrayal, she still loved him, and she hated herself for it. But as she rested her head against his shoulder, listening to the steady rhythm of Sophie's heartbeat, she knew that for now, that love was the only thing keeping her from falling apart. The sterile scent of the hospital mixed with the quiet beeping of monitors, each sound amplifying the tension that had settled over Ethan like a crushing weight. He had barely moved from Sophie's bedside, afraid that if he looked away for even a second, he might lose her forever. His daughter, his little girl, lay pale and fragile beneath a tangle of wires and IV tubes. The sight was unbearable, a reminder of all the moments he had missed, all the years he had wasted chasing power and money instead of being the father she deserved. Ethan reached out hesitantly, his fingers brushing against her tiny hand. Hey, princess, he whispered, his voice trembling. Daddy's here. The words felt foreign on his tongue. He had never called himself her father before. Not because he didn't want to, but because he never thought he deserved to. But now, none of that mattered. All that mattered was her. Sophie stirred slightly, her small fingers twitching in response. Ethan swallowed past the lump in his throat, praying that this was a sign that she could hear him. You're so strong, sweetheart, he murmured. You get that from your mom. She's the strongest person I've ever known. A tear slipped down his cheek as memories of Isabella flooded his mind. The way she had looked at him with so much love all those years ago. The way he had destroyed everything with his betrayal. The way she had raised Sophie all on her own. She had been strong for their daughter when he had been too weak. And now, he had one chance to make it right. Across the room, Isabella sat curled up in a chair, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. Her body was still, but her mind was in chaos. She had fought so hard to keep Sophie safe. And now, no matter how much she wanted to protect her, it was out of her hands. Isabella looked at Ethan, watching the way his fingers clung to their daughter's hand like it was his lifeline. He was crying. She had never seen him cry before. For years, she had imagined this moment, the day you would finally feel the weight of what he had lost. The day you would regret choosing another woman over their family. She had dreamed of telling him that it was too late, that he had no right to come back into their lives now. That she and Sophie didn't need him. But watching him now, watching him break in front of their daughter, watching the way his hands trembled with fear and grief, she felt something shift inside her. Because, despite everything, she could see it in his eyes. He loved Sophie. Maybe he hadn't always been there. Maybe he had made terrible choices. Maybe she would never be able to forgive him completely. But the pain in his face was real. And for the first time in years, Isabella allowed herself to wonder, could he still be the father Sophie needed? The doctor's footsteps echoed through the room, making both Ethan and Isabella jump. Mr. Hawkins, Ms. Thompson, Dr. Patel began, her face solemn. We need to talk about Sophie's condition. Isabella's stomach clenched. Ethan immediately stood up, stepping closer. She made it through surgery. The doctor continued, offering the smallest reassurance, but her heart is still weak. The next 24 hours are critical. The weight of those words hit Isabella like a punch to the chest. The next 24 hours. The difference between life and death. Ethan ran a hand through his hair, his breath uneven. What can we do? Dr. Patel sighed. There's not much more we can do but wait. Right now, it's up to her. Ethan felt his knees go weak. It was up to Sophie now. And he had never felt so helpless in his life. That night, while Isabella dozed off in exhaustion, Ethan remained at Sophie's bedside. He had never been a religious man. But now, With nothing left to do, he bowed his head and whispered a prayer. "Please," he murmured, gripping Sophie's tiny hand. "I know I don't deserve this. I know I've made mistakes. But if there's a chance for her, if there's a way to give her more time, please, don't take her away." His voice broke, his shoulders shaking with silent sobs. "If I had to give up everything, my money, my business, just let her live. Let me have a chance to be her father. Just one chance." A tear splashed onto Sophie's hand. And then, suddenly, her fingers twitched. Ethan sucked in a breath, his heart pounding. It was small, barely anything, but it was there. "Sophie?" he whispered. Her tiny eyelids fluttered. And then, in the smallest, weakest voice, she whispered, "Daddy?" Ethan choked back a sob, his hands shaking as he leaned closer. "Yeah, princess, I'm here." She blinked up at him, her blue eyes hazy and exhausted. "You came." Ethan let out a trembling breath. "Of course I did, baby. I'll always come." Isabella woke up at the sound of their voices, her heart stopping when she saw Sophie awake. "Oh my God," she gasped, rushing to her daughter's side. "Sophie, sweetheart." Sophie turned her head slowly, a sleepy smile tugging at her lips. "Mommy." Isabella burst into tears, pressing kisses all over her daughter's face. And for the first time in days, hope filled the room. Sophie's recovery was slow but steady. Ethan never left her side. Every morning, he brought her a new stuffed animal. Every afternoon, he read her stories. Every night, he stayed until she fell asleep. And with every passing day, Isabella saw it more clearly. He wasn't the same man who had left her all those years ago. One evening, as they watched Sophie color in her hospital bed, Ethan turned to Isabella. "I meant what I said before," he murmured. She looked at him, confused. "About what?" "About giving up everything for her." Ethan pulled a document from his briefcase and handed it to her. It was a resignation letter. "I'm leaving my company," he said. "I'm selling my shares. I want to be here, for her. For you, if you'll let me." Isabella's breath caught in her throat. "Why?" she whispered. Ethan met her eyes, his gaze raw with emotion. "Because I finally understand what matters," he said softly. "And it's not money. It's not power. It's her. It's you." Tears filled Isabella's eyes. For years, she had convinced herself that he would never change. But looking at him now, maybe, just maybe, he had. The soft glow of morning sunlight filtered through the hospital blinds, casting golden streaks across the white bedsheets. The beeping of monitors had become a comforting rhythm, a sign that Sophie was still here. Still fighting, still getting stronger. Ethan sat beside her bed, holding her small hand in his own. Every rise and fall of her chest felt like a miracle, a gift he had nearly lost. He had spent years chasing power, money, success, things that now felt so hollow compared to this one moment. He brushed a stray curl from Sophie's forehead. Watching her sleep, he had made so many mistakes. But he was here now. And he wasn't going anywhere. Behind him, a soft rustling caught his attention. He turned to see Isabella standing in the doorway, her arms crossed, eyes searching his face. "She's improving," she said softly. Ethan nodded. "Yeah, she's strong, like her mother." A small, hesitant smile touched Isabella's lips. There had been a time when she never would have believed Ethan could be this man, the one sitting by their daughter's bedside, the one who had given up everything to be here. Yet here he was. "You should get some rest," she said. "You've been here all night." Ethan shook his head, eyes never leaving Sophie. "I can't leave her. Not again." The raw sincerity in his voice made Isabella's heart ache. She had waited years to hear him say those words. She had spent so long hating him, resenting him, protecting herself and Sophie from the pain of his absence. But now, for the first time, she let herself wonder, was it possible to forgive? The weeks that followed were filled with small, quiet moments of healing. Sophie was discharged from the hospital, her laughter slowly returning, her energy rebuilding with each passing day. Ethan moved into an apartment nearby, close enough to be part of her life without overstepping. He took Sophie to the park, helped her with schoolwork, and learned how to braid her hair, though his attempts were disastrous at first. Most importantly, he showed up, again and again. He proved, not with grand gestures, but with consistency, that he was a different man now. Isabella watched cautiously at first, still afraid to let her guard down. But as weeks turned into months, She saw Ethan for who he was, not just a man full of regrets, but a father who had finally learned what it meant to love selflessly. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching Sophie chase fireflies, Ethan turned to Isabella. "I know I don't deserve forgiveness," he said, "but I want to earn it." She looked at him, truly looked at him, and saw something she hadn't seen in years. Honesty, humility, hope. "Ethan," she whispered, "I don't know if I can ever forget what happened. I don't expect you to," he admitted. "I just hope that maybe, one day, we can try again, not for the past, but for who we are now." Her heart ached at the truth in his words. She had spent years convincing herself that love could never be rebuilt once it was shattered. But sitting here, watching their daughter twirl in the fading sunlight, listening to Ethan speak with such quiet sincerity, maybe she had been wrong. Maybe love wasn't about never making mistakes. Maybe it was about learning from them, choosing to grow, and having the courage to start again. She reached for his hand, her fingers brushing against his. It was a small step, but it was a beginning. Months later, on a crisp autumn morning, Ethan stood at the entrance of the new community school, the school Isabella had fought to build. The school he had helped fund after leaving his business behind. Children ran past him, their laughter filling the air as they rushed inside. Sophie stood beside him, holding his hand. "Are you excited for your first day, princess?" he asked. Sophie beamed up at him, her eyes shining. "Mommy says I get to help the other kids learn to read." Ethan smiled, ruffling her hair. "You're going to do great." Just then, Isabella appeared, carrying a stack of books. She paused, taking in the sight of Ethan and Sophie together, the warmth, the love, the undeniable bond they had rebuilt. For the first time in years, she felt whole. Ethan turned to her, his heart swelling with something deeper than love, gratitude. For a second chance. For a future he never thought he deserved. For a family that had found its way back together. Life doesn't always give second chances. But when it does, it's up to us to make them count. Ethan made mistakes, terrible ones. But instead of running from them, he faced them. Instead of making excuses, he changed. And that's what redemption is, not erasing the past, but proving, every single day, that you've learned from it. If this story touched your heart, leave a comment below. Should Isabella give Ethan another chance? Do you believe people can truly change? Tell us your thoughts. We love hearing from you. And don't forget to like this video if you're rooting for Sophie's happiness. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more stories of love, redemption, and second chances. Because sometimes, the most beautiful endings come from the most broken beginnings.